Well, welcome everybody to first Environmental Humanities public lecture for this year. I'm very happy to have a relative local to speak with us tonight, kick off the series. Merle Patchett is lecturer in geography at Bristol, and she is cultural historical geographer working on more than human histories. And she has publications in transactions, cultural geographies, and she will tell you a bit more about where this work fits in her ongoing research. And I'll also mention that she's actually co-supervising one of our South West and Wales doctoral training programme students who's being supervised across Bristol and Bath Spa with Owen and JD Dewsbury, also at Bristol. Merle is going to speak with us today on the intriguing topic of From Sexual Selection to Sex and the City, the Bio-Geographies of the Blue Bird of Paradise. So take it away, Merle. Thanks.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Kate, and for the invitation. It's great to be here. I've known about the Environmental Humanities programme at Bath for a while now, and I've always been quite excited to kind of see what's going on here. So it's nice to finally make it here. It's a beautiful campus. The building's amazing. It's like you've got amazing toilets. Much better than Bristol's. So I'm impressed. Yeah. This paper this presentation is also part of a paper which is going to be part of a special issue on the preserved animal body in the Journal of Social History. And so if you do have any feedback to give me on some of the more theoretical arguments coming from the paper, I really would appreciate that, because it will help me to fine-tune the paper even further, hopefully. Okay. And also thanks for having me, it's nice to be here, nice to see you all. Okay, so I'm a cultural historical geographer by training, as Kate said. My research broadly focuses on theories, histories and geographies of practice. This focus has led me to kind of empirically engage with a range of specialised skills, from taxidermy to plumasserie, practitioners from artists, artisans and architects, and with places of practice, so museums, galleries and archives. I can categorise my work into kind of four main themes. The first is historical geographies of craftwork, skill and apprenticeship. The second is the writing and curating of more than human histories. The third is experimental geographical methods, so the practising of post-humanism, as I like to call it. And the fourth is petrocultures and architectures. But today I'm going to focus on that kind of second theme, which is the writing and curating of more than human histories. So back in 2006, when I just started my PhDs, a long time ago now, my PhD research into the historical geographies of taxidermy, calls were being made to bring the animals back into humanities and social science research. A diverse body of geographical writing now thrives on the more than human dimensions of human-animal encounters. Such work sits within a wider post-humanist turn throughout the social sciences and humanities, challenging the privileged position of the modern human subject and aiming to animate scholarship by including the subjectivities, sensibilities and agencies previously excluded from consideration. This refocusing of geographical concerns has in turn been characterised by a need to create a more radical politics and experimental methodological ethos, so that we can accommodate the complexity and variations of the living world back into our geographical researches. The traditional humanist orthodoxies that underpin much of our research practices in human geography have therefore been found wanting. Calls have since been made to reconfigure, or at least supplement, our traditional repertoire of humanist methodologies. According to Sarah Watmore, this requires extending the company modality of what constitutes a research subject, amplifying sensory, bodily and affective registers, and engaging with knowledges, practices and vernaculars which exist beyond the academy. Watmore's provocations have inspired a flurry of projects that have developed research practices and modes of address that collectively mark what she calls more than human approaches to the world. These include, but are not limited to, and I'm sure many of you are involved in these, multi-species ethnographies and biographies, moving image methodologies, phenomenological experiments with ethology, and material processes of writing. Problems arise, however, for the historical researcher as the immersive ethnographic methods favoured by more than human modes of address are not so easily transposed into historical modes of research, which are often more rooted in representational and textual forms of expression, for example, words, texts, and archives. Yet I find through my own research traces of non-human life hibernate in our libraries, attics, and archives, and museums. This said, the researching and writing of more than human histories presents serious ontological and epistemological challenges to the traditional textualisms of historical studies. For example, non-human animals and ecologies do not leave behind a written record, thus any evidence of their presence in the historical record is indelibly marked with anthropocentrism. However, rather than accepting these limitations, a more radical approach is required. Accommodating more than human presences and multi-species practices of the past, and not merely their cultural and anthropomorphized interpretation, demands that we challenge historical studies' adjectival humanism. Dipesh Chakrabarty has already highlighted how the age of the Anthropocene collapses traditional epistemological distinctions between natural and human history. And in response to the human exceptionalism that the Anthropocene seems to perpetuate, Donna Haraway has appealed for scholars to learn to somehow to narrate, to think, outside the prick tail of humans in history. For me, this requires concerted and creative engagement with the animal archive, that mass of materials produced in the collaborative presence of all manner of beastly agencies. Natural history museums and collections have proved to be a key site for such engagement throughout my research career to date. Natural history museums contain vast collections of specimens as well as terabytes of data derived from those collections. While they are, of course, an important scientific asset, they also contain a wealth of information about how we've collected and quantified nature and therefore conceptualized human-animal relations across time and space. Moreover, the exhibits and the traditions and crafts of exhibiting are also important historical assets to be considered for researching and curating more than human histories and connecting with audiences in new ways. This is because it can provide historical perspectives on nature and culture and offer critical insights for understanding current nature culture challenges such as climate change and biodiversity loss, or for what I have termed the telling of Bio-Geographies. Bio-geography traditionally refers to a subdiscipline of geography concerned with the mapping, the patterns of the spatial distribution of animals. The term has, however, recently been reworked by a range of geographers interested in rethinking the relationship between the bio and the geo, and of renewing the place of life in its multiplicity of human and non-human forms, processes, and connectivities. In my own work, the term offers an alternative biographical practice and titles a series of collaborative works exploring the lively geographies of natural history specimens. Here, instead of repeating the anthropocentrically inflected and linear process of tracing a specimen's biography, which often connotes tracing the individual specimen's history within the museum, and thus a focus on telling the stories about the people who collected them or the institutions that encased them, it rather becomes an act of tracing and placing the specimen within the life and death worlds of human-animal encounter and estrangement that produced, mobilised, and maintained it over time and space. For example, one particular specimen at the Hunterian Museum at the University of Glasgow provided the starting point for a collaborative bio-geographical inquiry. That was the skull of the blue antelope, known as Hippotragus leucophaius. The blue antelope is an extinct South African animal. Once found in the Cape of Good Hope, it was extinct by 1800. Only 2 skulls are thought to exist, one in Glasgow and one in Amsterdam. 4 mounted skins survive within old European natural history collections in Leiden, Vienna, Uppsala and Paris. Closer to where it last roamed, less complete paleontological remains have been found. In these forms, the blue antelope endures, preserved in the collections and annals of zoological sciences. However, this placement of the blue antelope has led to what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls epistemicide, that is, extermination of knowledge and ways of knowing. Through a collaboration with environmental artist Kate Foster and geographer Hayden Lorimer, our aim was to explore and promote different ways of knowing the blue antelope by relabelling and representing the Blue Antelope and its museological remains. Such a project introduces diverse possibilities to reframe and retell zoological specimens, where the status of object does not contain all the animal still has to offer. For example, through the creation of a web archive at www.blueantelope.info, we generated further ways for people to encounter the Glasgow skull and offered an expanded repertoire of interpretation engagement with the diverse animals in life and death. For us at least, the steady accumulation of knowledge about the extinct animal and the process of representation opened up a dialogic space where awkward but more pressing geographical questions could be asked. For example, by which world should the blue antelope be known? By what territorial arrangement should we place it? And according to whose voice, language, values? Although the blue antelope offers rich terrain for exploring these questions have also more recently framed my engagement with another blue beast, the blue bird of paradise, the bio-geographical subject of this presentation. I was recently in New York on the hunt for birds of paradise. While their natural habitat is 9,000 miles away in the rainforests of Papua New Guinea, I had it on good authority that I could find some particularly intriguing examples at famed Chelsea fashion emporium New York Vintage. New York Vintage is, according to their website, the ultimate source worldwide for the finest vintage couture and designer clothing and accessories. Their hand-selected permanent archive, which spans over 150 years of fashion history, is a destination of choice for filming TV costume designers in search of that special something. The day I visited, I was in pursuit of an extremely rare blue bird of paradise specimen. Though rare, the millinery specimen became wildly famous after it perched atop the head of Carrie Bradshaw during the ill-fated wedding scenes of Sex and the City the movie, acting as her something blue. To get a closer look at this curiously blue bird, I had booked an appointment with New York Vintage conservator Carlos Benavides. Benavides specialises in the conservation of millinery apparel and is an expert in the history and arts of the plumassier. Originating in the 1700s, the profession encompasses the cleaning, bleaching, dyeing, curling and making up of plumes and feathers for fashion and interiors. At the height of the plume boom, from about 1880 to 1910, when the wings, heads and bodies of millions of birds were prepared for millinery adornment, plumassiers were an ubiquitous part of commercial districts in Europe and North America. Today, plumassiers are considered a dying breed, and Benavides is one of the last people living in North America to know and still practice the secrets of the craft. As I was in the midst of curating an exhibition about the international plume boom, I arrived at my appointment, excited to have an audience with a master of the craft and to encounter my quarry, the fabled blue bird of paradise. As Benavides carefully unwrapped the blue bird of paradise from its tissue paper, he recounted the story of how he'd come to acquire the bird. He'd rescued it from being thrown in a bonfire after its owner had recently inherited an estate and was burning items he felt were problematic or of little importance. He intervened after a mutual acquaintance recognised it as a preserved bird of paradise and that it might be of interest to the millinery conservator. It was fitting that Benavides could save the bird from the bonfire, as it related to me that the reason millinery birds of paradise specimens are so rare today, and I have a couple of examples here, was because even though tens of thousands of them were killed and preserved annually during the plume boom, milliners and plumassiers were ordered to burn their plumage stocks after the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. This act, strengthening the earlier Lacey Act of 1900, banned the trade in migratory and exotic bird parts and feathers across the US in a bid to protect the many bird species that were being decimated as a result of the plumage trade. Entire contents of millinery stockrooms were often confiscated and turned into feather bonfires by officials enforcing the act because it was difficult to tell what birds the feathers belonged to. For example, Benavides informed me that the blue bird of paradise specimen was actually not an example of the Paradisa rudolfi, which is a bird of paradise species that has natural electric blue wing and flank plumes. Rather, it was more likely a greater or lesser bird of paradise, the Paradisa apoda or Paradisa minor, that had been dyed blue. At the same time as acquiring the dyed blue bird of paradise, Benavides had also been gifted 2 millinery preserved greater bird of paradise specimens. When he laid these specimens next to the blue for comparison, it became clear it was definitely not an example of Paradisa rudolfi. On closer inspection, I could make out the dye was fading on the crest feathers to reveal the Paradisea apoda's natural golden yellow hue. Its Paradisea rodolphi, by comparison, has black crest, throat and nape feathers. Although it may seem odd to dye these naturally vibrantly coloured feathers, plumaceus had to remain au courant with the changeable whims of the fashion industry. Fashions in feathers were therefore as variable as fashions in garment styles, textiles and jewellery. Bird of paradise feathers in parts, predominantly the Paradisea apoda and minor, as their plumes were the lightest in colour and therefore the easiest to dye, were dyed all colours of the rainbow to suit changing fashion styles. Dyed or not, on encountering the bird of paradise skins, the erythral beauty and luxurious quality of their plumage is immediately felt, making it easy to comprehend why they have for millennia been ornaments, commodities and gifts. For as long as can be remembered, Papuan tribes used the exuberant plumes of the males to adorn themselves during ceremonies and war, and as early as 3000 BC, their plumes entered the luxury trade via the Moluccas, where they were particularly coveted for the headdresses of Moroccan Islamic sultanates. Europeans, by comparison, were relatively late in discovering the seductive wonders of the birds of paradise. The very first bird of paradise skins were brought from New Guinea to Europe in 1522 by the surviving crew of the only ship to complete Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe. The 5 skins that returned with Magellan's crew ignited an enduring Euro-American fascination with birds of paradise as objects of aesthetic desire, from Muse to some of the greatest ornithologists to the most sought-after material for the chicest fashion houses and, more recently, television's most famous fashionista. In reciting these geographies of consumption, circulation and display, it is also not hard to imagine why the pursuit of commodity stories has become an increasingly prominent activity among scholars. The intellectual ideas that things have social lives and are in motion have helped to broaden conventional economic interpretations of the commodity by highlighting how economic activities are influenced by social and cultural activities and vice versa. However, given we are now in an economic era in which, as Donald Haraway has argued, life itself has become a locus of accumulation, then picking apart the category of liveliness underpinning commodification has important analytical and geographical stakes. This is a particularly pertinent task when considering the blue bird of paradise, as it was once living and, as will be explored, derives much of its value from the status. Thankfully, a recent surge in studies focused on uncovering the geographies of what Haraway terms lively commodities has helped to recast the theoretical and epistemic underpinnings of commodity biographies. For example, the commodity stories of caterpillar fungus, matsutake mushrooms, and even the semen of pedimenti bulls examine how, and importantly what, characteristics of life complicate capital accumulation and regimes of value. However, where for the most part these stories largely explore contemporary commodities of biocapitalism, the geographer man Barua pushes the lively commodity back in time by tracing the historical commodity geographies of Asiatic lions. By tracking specific moments in which liveliness appears and is rendered for sale, from the regal emblem and desired trophy, tourism spectacle and conservation icon, Barua demonstrates how Haraway's concept of encounter value can be thought of as a process of value generation, where the bodies, ethologies and liveliness of an animal makes a difference to, and indeed is constitutive of, those very relations which render or mobilise it as a commodity. Although dead and dyed blue, it is clear from my own encounter with the blue bird of paradise that its exuberant plumage is constitutive of the relations that have mobilised it as a commodity across time and place. And as Arun Sondala has argued, when Malay traders began trading bird of paradise skins, they were really mobilising the objective effects of sexual selection that produced and continue to produce the genus Paradiseae's sought-after plumes. Sexual selection refers to the process through which biological traits and characteristics evolve in aid copulation, which is why for Brian Masumi it expresses an inventive animal exuberance, attaching qualities to life with no direct use value or survival value. However, for the traders, just like for the birds, these qualities of life directly shape the blue bird of paradise's encounter value. Moreover, these qualities of life did not expire when the bird did. Rather, they remained attached to the bird's skin and in turn encouraged attachments. meaning it is always in excess of its commodity form. The remainder of this paper will therefore chart the bluebird of paradise's bio-geographies of excess from sexual selection to sex in the city, tracing the lively geographies of this dead bird from New Guinea rainforest to New York streets, offers the opportunity of narrating collective, natural and cultural change over time and space. This is because the bluebird of paradise can be thought of as a telling example of the millions of paradisei that were hunted, traded, shipped and lusted after since the earliest forms of commodification. In this way, rather than being passive props or passive agents in a giant plot written by some overseeing entity, these animal archives, like the bluebird of paradise, are figured as active agents in their mobilisations and documentations. And human storytellers are therefore obliged to remain alert to the ways in which our stories collectively shape and are shaped by non-human existences. Distinctions drawn between natural and cultural history therefore seem beside the point, when the starting point of our investigations is that the relationship between human and non-human worlds are inextricably intertwined. All this said, what is not beside the point is the issue of post-coloniality. Most of the archival materials that map the collective biogeographies of preserved bird of paradise skins are Eurocentric in origin, and one cannot escape that the bird's mobilisation as commodities was largely produced and sustained by colonising and imperial histories. Moreover, the common effect of these histories is to obscure or erase prior histories, which, as the anthropologist Stuart Kirsch, I don't know how you say that, acknowledges, is certainly the case with the birds of paradise. He outlines that although their significance for exchange was well established long before European intervention, very little remains to document the pre-colonial trade routes and social relations between New Guinea, Southeast Asia and Northern Australia. Thus, when Magellan's ship reached Melanesia in 1521, the birds of paradise not only became snared in a global colonial commodity chain, but also became commandeered by European imperial imaginaries. This is most intensely exemplified through the emergence of the Apoda myth. With the introduction of 5 trade skins from Magellan's voyage to Europe, the birds of paradise became a focus of intense scientific curiosity and study. The extraordinary beauty and rich colour of the birds' plumes meant that trade skins were highly sought after by European cabinet collectors. Collectors were particularly captivated by their unusual anatomy, as indigenous hunters had removed the legs during the preparation as tray skins. This gave rise to the European speculation that the birds did not have feet and instead spent their lives perpetually in flight, living off dew and never touching the earth till death. And I've got an example of a trade skin there. The mysteries of their lifestyle were suggested in a set of descriptions and illustrations produced by Ulysses Aldrovandi for his Encyclopedia Ornithologia, published in 1599. Considered one of the most respected naturalists of the period, Aldrovandi's illustrated natural history for the birds of paradise substantiated the idea that they only lived on sky dew and sunrays and never landed even when breeding, the female apparently laying her eggs in a special cavity on the male's back. Although some complete skins arrived in Europe from the early 1600s, refuting Aldrovandi and his peers' ideas, in 1758 Linnaeus knowingly perpetuated the myth by naming the greater bird of paradise, the largest of the genus, Paradisea apoda, the legless bird of paradise. The apoda story therefore highlights how imperial geographical imaginaries can work to, if not completely erase, at least misinterpret indigenous knowledges and labours. It also reminds me of the importance of attending to the issue of human power relations in more than human histories. The where of the encounter, what Haraway describes as contact zones and what species meet, therefore has important historical and political resonances. During the European Renaissance, birds of paradise were the quintessential embodiment of rarity and creation, and thus contact zones were largely confined to curiosity cabinets or the illustrated pages of natural histories like Aldrovandi's. Given that the birds were often badly preserved or fantastically represented, perceptions of the birds of paradise were therefore oddly shaped. Well-preserved skin specimens were therefore highly coveted by the most notable naturalists and artists of the times, with even Rembrandt making a charcoal study of 2 birds of paradise skins in 1640. Europeans continued to know very little about the behaviour and biology of birds of paradise until 19th century voyages of exploration made it possible for naturalists to carry out first-hand observations of the birds in the wild and to collect and prepare specimens using scientific preservation techniques. René Lesson, who served as a surgeon on Captain Dupray's round-the-world voyage, was one of the first Europeans to encounter the bird of paradise in their natural habitat. On encountering his first bird, he said he was too astonished to shoot due to its unparalleled beauty. He said, like a meteor cutting through the air, leaving a long trail of light. On his return, he published a natural history for the birds in 1835. However, it's clear from the descriptions and illustration that Lesson's observations were largely based on the study of skin specimens rather than direct observations of life, as there is still misinterpretation of the placement, display, and therefore purpose of the courtship feathers. As Alfred Russel Wallace was the first European naturalist to witness and describe birds of paradise courtship displays and to document the exchange and trade of their skins, his writings offer unique insight into how and why the Paradisea were mobilised as commodities both locally and globally. In 1854, Wallace ventured into the Malay archipelago of Southeast Asia in search of natural history specimens, including the coveted birds of paradise. He emerged 8 years later with 1,205,660 specimens, mostly birds and insects, including several birds of paradise skins, and a list of 18 recognised species. Wallace presents an autobiographical account of his collecting trip in his book, The Malay Archipelago, The Land of the Orangutan and the Bird of Paradise, from 1869. The book, as well as presenting descriptions of the lekking behaviour, such as the mating behaviour of the bird of paradise, he carefully repudiates the mythology and misinterpretations that had arisen in Europe around them since the earliest known trade skins of the genus returned on Magellan's ship. Wallace underlines that it was no small wonder that very little correct information was known about the birds, as even the Malay traders were working from the skins alone. Their name for the birds, Borong Koti, meaning dead birds, indicating that they never saw them alive. Wallace's account makes very clear it was prolonged encounter with the birds of paradise that would lead to enlightenment. To gain personal acquaintance with birds, Wallace was wholly dependent on indigenous knowledges and skilled labour. He had brought 2 Malay, what he called boys, from Dobbo, the Malay trading port, whose sole business, he said, was to shoot and skin birds, while he attended to the insects and to the observation and registry of the habitats of birds and animals during his walks in the forest. However, to access and negotiate the interior forest and thus encounter birds of paradise, Wallace also had to earn the trust of Papuan peoples who lived alongside the birds and knew their rhythms and routines of life. Although Wallace demonstrated a more sincere curiosity in other human cultures than many of his contemporary evolutionists, he still used prejudicial language to describe their appearance and ways of life, even when pointing out his earnest belief that the civilized can learn something from the savage man. As Wallace rightly acknowledges, it was through his Papuan guides' expertise in forest craft that he got unparalleled access to the birds' display trees, enabling him to observe their behaviour firsthand and to publish the first scientific descriptions of the courtship lekking behaviour of the greater bird of paradise in the Annals of the Magazine of Natural History in 1857. Wallace's descriptions of greater bird of paradise courtship display helped to substantiate Darwin's theory of sexual selection and is still cited as a telling example of runaway sexual selection in the biological sciences today. However, what is ignored by this way of knowing sexual selection is that it was already being performatively storied by the humans who lived alongside the birds. The anthropologist Stuart Kirsch describes how males of the Yogam tribe, who he speculates may have also been Wallace's forest guides, take part in a dance performance which they call a yok, where they wear headdresses that feature plumes from the greater bird of paradise, and they mimic the rhythmic movement of the birds. Like the male birds that congregate in the display trees, Kirsch explains that the dancers seek to attract the attention of eligible females in the tribe who have come to view their performance. He says, in both contexts, the sublime beauty of the plumes and the rhythmic nature of the dance contribute to the desired effect of seduction. This mode of consensual symbiosis indicates how the birds of paradise were demonstrating to humans what profitability was all about. This is also the reason why Haraway prefers biologies of multi-species becoming with to Darwinian origin stories, where competition is seen as a dominant framework for understanding evolutionary change. Rather than there being an origin of species, according to symbiogenesis, there is the co-evolution of species, and therefore it becomes untenable to track the individual evolution of species and to continue make the case for the human exceptionalism or human-only histories. The birds of paradise excessive animal exuberance also explains why, for Saldanha, evolutionary creativity is absolutely without subject. It could therefore be argued that the paradise exuberant plumage has shaped human understandings of evolution, aesthetics, and even the excessiveness of life itself. At the time of writing the Malay archipelago, Wallace was certain his description of their vivacity would excite afresh both scientific and popular interest in the birds. To examine the birds' vivacity in greater detail, he had his hunters bring to him some birds alive and set one of his men to take a large bamboo cage with troughs for food and water in the hope that he would be able to keep some of them. According to Barua, captivity can provide greater durability to encounters through its confinement of animal life worlds. This was clearly Wallace's aim. However, although he fed the birds with fruits and live grasshoppers, which they ate greedily, he said, not 1 out of 10 lived more than 3 days, and so he turned his attentions to preserving specimens in as good condition as possible. However, where captivity guaranteed their imminent demise, according to Wallace, there was less guarantee when hunting live birds of paradise. He writes, the adults frequent the loftiest trees and are shy and wary, and so strong and tenacious of life that I know no bird of its size so difficult to kill. Wallace's description of the bird's tenaciousness helpfully underscores how encounters with animals in the wild are, in Barua's words, ephemeral and subject to recalcitrance, and also dependent on sensing technologies and skilled human labour. To secure the skin specimen, Wallace was again dependent on the indigenous hunting knowledges and techniques of his guides, and the now globalising tribute economy. Wallace notes by the time of his arrival on the Malay Peninsula, birds of paradise were very much already an article of commerce, and he outlines how the gift economy of tribute was being rerouted into global colonial commodity change via Dutch colonialism. He writes that, I believe that all except the most common species of commerce are now much more difficult to obtain than they were even 20 years ago, and I impute it principally to their having been sought by the Dutch officials through the Sultan of Trudor. Wallace also recounts resistance to his want to purchase skins of rarer birds of paradise species. He says, they have a vague and very unnatural dread of some ulterior object and a white man's coming at so much trouble and expense to their country only to get birds of paradise, of which they know can be bought plenty at Ternate, Massacre and Singapore. And as the next section shall show, they were right to dread the presence of the white man and to question the motivations for acquiring plumes. Humans, as the Yogam dancers exemplify, have adorned themselves with bird of paradise plumes for as long as can be remembered. However, the thirst for exotic ornament amongst fashionable women in the metropoles of Europe and North America precipitated a global plume boom in avian apparel from 1880s until the 1920s. At the height of the boom, the business of killing birds for the millinery trade was practiced on a global scale. It involved the death of hundreds of millions of birds in many parts of the world. Often the wings, heads and entire bodies of birds were used to adorn hats. London was the imperial centre of the trade in exotic feathers, while most of the manufacturing took place in Paris or New York. Birds of all kinds were consumed for both their feather and bodily appearance. However, birds of paradise plumes were particularly coveted for their sumptuous and exuberant colours. The The What Women Are Wearing section of the New York Times, dated September 20th, 1904, indicates how women were wearing paradise apparel. Mrs. John Jacob Astor is wearing a chic purple crinoline hat with a small, flat, round crown and a wide brim that curves over a bit at the edges and then rises at the right front and describes a wide, flaring semicircle to a point at the back of the left ear. Its sole trimming is a black bird of paradise plume that starts from the left of the crown and sweeps upward, outward and backward against both brim and crown. Mrs. Clarence Mackay wears a hat to match her frocks, the hats being made to go with such costumes. The other evening, she had on at dinner at Sherry's a charming light blue large round hat of pearly grey-white tulle, shirred in invisible wires and quite transparent as to the wide brim. From the front and left of the hat floated a plume of white bird of paradise feathers. Beru has argued that the corporeal affordances of lively commodities provide a set of useful diagnostics to unpack value in relational terms. The description of Mrs. Astor and Mrs. Mackay suggests that both they and their admirer value the birds of paradise plumes for their bodily effects. They are not simply wearing a dead bird on their head or representing exotic tropicality. Rather, they are performatively harnessing the bird's ethereal beauty and effervescent movement. Kirsch has described the practice of Western women mobilising bird of paradise plumes as a reverse anthropology of the male yogam dancers' performances, demonstrating that although separated along geographical, cultural and gender lines, they were connected by a desire to perform paradise. The practice of using bird of paradise accessory plumes to accessorise human performances could also be thought of as a form of reverse ethology. Beru, following Deleuze, argues that because bodies cannot be cleaved from an organism's ethologies, part of the encounter value of lively commodities is that they can put us in touch with the ethological potentials of animals. Thus, much like the birds of paradise had taught the yogam what profligacy was all about, they also taught well-chapeaued Western women about the seductive powers of exuberant excess. This is why encounter value for Beru, with its emphasis on ethological and corporeal potentials of animals, enables one to account for how liveliness co-constructs the meaning, allure and desirability of commodities. An 1875 edition of Harper's Bazaar detailing how birds of paradise were being attached to hats confirms that liveliness was part of the paradisa's appeal. It says, "The entire bird is used and is mounted on wires and springs that permit the head and wings to be moved about in the most natural manner." The consumers of paradisa apparel are therefore expressly attempting to mobilise the bird's lively effects. However, according to Nicole Shuskin, theorisations of animal capital, these economies of mimesis are also fetishistic, as they exemplify Marx's insight that commodity fetishism can be charismatic in its lifelike effects. Moreover, as fetishistic renderings of animal life, they also veil the violent geographies behind their mobilisation as lively commodities. The corollary of the growing accessibility of birds of paradise plumes in Western markets was a detrimental impact the trade was having on living populations of birds of paradise. In his 1913 book, Our Vanishing Wildlife, W.T. Hornaday wrote of the situation, Bird lovers must now bid farewell forever to all the birds of paradise. Nothing but the legal closing of the world's markets against their plumes and skin can save them. Take the great bird of paradise, Paradisa apoda, as illustration. On October 2nd, 1912, at Indianapolis, Indiana, a city in the centre of the United States, in 3 show windows within 100 feet of the headquarters of the 4th National Conservation Congress, I counted 11 stuffed heads and 11 complete sets of plumes of this bird displayed for sale. The prices ranged from $30 to $47.50 each. And while I looked, a large lady approached, pointed her finger at the remains of a greater bird of paradise, and with grim determination said to her shopping companion, "There, I want one of them, and I'm going to have it too." Hornaday's description of the 11 heads and skins pinned to a board offer a stark contrast to the descriptions of Mrs. Astor and Mrs. Mackay's mobilisations of the paradisa's ethological and corporeal affordances, and instead put us in touch with the dead worlds of the plumage trade, its acts of killing and economic cargoes of feathery remains. Therefore, while Levin has certainly helped to co-construct the embodied encounter value of the paradisa, it also masks the necrogeographies of capitalist accumulation that enable these Western consumer encounters. Sensitive to this issue, Hornaday compiled a list of all the birds, including the many birds of paradise species, which were being brought to the brink of extinction for the London and continental feather markets. At the height of feather fashions in the UK, so around 1901 to 1910, 362,000 pounds of exotic feathers were imported into the United Kingdom at a total value of £19,923,000. To underline the scale of the trade, Hornaday compiled a table detailing the number of exotic feathers and skins being sold at 4 of London's busiest commercial sale rooms, Hales & Sons, Dalton & Young, Figgis & Co. and Lewis & Peat in 1911. The total number of Bird of Paradise skins auctioned during these sales was 20,698. It is worth underlining that according to Hornaday, these 3 sales only represent 6 months, and that very nearly double this quantity was sold by these 4 firms annually. Sales did not vary much from year to year either, and in the following year, 1912, 24,579 birds of paradise were sold by the same 4 firms over the same period. While these sales give a good indication of the annual sales of London feather merchants, it is worth pointing out that not all the skins were brought to the London feather market. Very large shipments were also made direct to the raw feather dealers and manufacturers of Paris, Berlin, Amsterdam and New York. Bird of Paradise plumes also commanded the highest prices in the London auctions. This was partly due to their rarity in comparison to other varieties of birds, and partly due to the cost of shipping them via China, where the skins were tanned from remote New Guinea. The economic rewards to be had in harvesting Bird of Paradise from plumes inspired Dutch, Chinese and Australian traders to seek their fortunes in New Guinea's rainforest, which was one of the most lucrative hunting grounds during the international plume boom. Dutch colonialism had not only rerouted the Papuan and Malay exchange economies of Bird of Paradise skins into a one-way capitalist supply chain, it also significantly scaled up the killing enterprise. According to historian Corey Ross, the introduction of guns from 1870 and establishment of regular steamship connection in 1890 significantly boosted exports to London, Amsterdam and Paris. Ross also estimates that 30,000 to 80,000 skins were being exported annually from the Dutch half of the island at the height of the boom. We know from Wallace's accounts that prior to Dutch intervention, the Aru Islanders had been enacting a sustainable practice, using hides and hunting with arrows and only killing mature birds. However, Cribb explains that during the boom, Papuans were largely using firearms to kill the birds because the accessory feathers were most valued. They could avoid some spoilage for the carcasses for the sake of a greater kill rate. The Papuan hunters were hiring firearms from Malay hunters and traders, who in turn were dependent on being provided with hunting equipment from the Dutch and Chinese trading companies. According to Cribb, there was an appreciable turnover in Malay hunters who also feared returning to the Moluccas because they could not pay their debts or had been killed by Papuans. These violent practices and relations underline the destructive impact colonialism was not only having on the Birds of Paradise life worlds, but also their entangled ways of life. Tom Van Duren has written that in each case of near extinction, a different way of life, a different set of relationships and entangled significances is at stake. Where once Papuans would have spared immature birds, as they only wanted their skins for the headdresses, they were now enrolled in a global colonial juggernaut of expansionism and exterminism, shifting the relationship with the Birds of Paradise from one of becoming with to becoming without. Anxiety over the overexploitation of the birds were first recorded in an 1819 article by a former resident at Ternate, FSA de Klerk. He writes, "Now that the birds are almost never found along the coast and the killing has moved to the interior, it will not be long before nothing remains of these most glorious products of creation, which are a delight to ornithologists and a wonder to the whole world." However, accurate population studies evidencing the threat of extermination proved difficult to obtain, and very little progress was made in terms of implementing protection measures. As Cribb asserts, more than 10 years between 1897 and 1907 of deliberation on the life and death of the birds had come to nothing. Moreover, while the British instituted a ban on commercial hunting in British New Guinea in 1909, the legislation was ineffectual as it contained many loopholes and was therefore very difficult to enforce. This ban is, however, indicative of the pressure that was being placed on colonial administrations by their metropolitan governments and conservationists. Saving the brilliant birds of paradise had become the cause célèbre of the Society of Protection of Birds and the Audubon Society, societies which had been formed to counter the barbarous trade in plumes. Furthermore, when the Dutch Indies Society for Nature Conservation was founded in 1912, it adopted the bird of paradise as its logo. For Barua, this groundswell of activism can again be explained by encounter value. Just as the women wearing their plumes were mobilising the Paradise's ethological and corporeal affordances, these affordances served as rallying points for both scientists and conservationists. The bird of paradise were therefore not just textbook examples of sexual selection or symbols of what might be lost through the overexploitation of the natural world. Rather, and to paraphrase Barua, the liveliness of the birds of paradise, their ability to touch people through carnal, aesthetic and ethological encounters, from the outset constituted and made a difference to those situations where they were mobilised for conservation goals. Therefore, while liveliness masked the natural geographies of the plumage trade, it ensured that the Paradise also withstood the complete deadening effects of the commodification process. However, Cribb points out that although conservationist arguments were marked by a strong sense of urgency, progress in terms of on-the-ground protection was still very slow. The Germans had instituted a blanket ban on the trade of bird of paradise skins on their half of New Guinea in 1913, following the US ban on the import of feathers in 1912. However, after a hunting hiatus due to slaughter of another kind, that being World War I, the enterprise took on a renewed vigour, and the Dutch didn't impose a similar prohibitions on hunting until 1922, a year after the British had eventually passed their plumage bill. For Cribb, the timings of these interventions suggest that it was the conservationist pressure placed on metropolitan governments, along with gradual change in fashion, rather than colonial regulation, that made the biggest difference to the fate of the animals. For me, this also suggests that it was cosmopolitan women who made the biggest difference to the birds. This is because, although women were the ones wearing the plumes, they were also some of the most prominent anti-plumage activists, founding that Society for Protection of Birds and the Audubon Society in the US, and making up over 90% of their membership. Moreover, the first resolution calling for legislation in all countries to prevent the destruction of birds for millinery purposes was carried out at the Women's International Congress in Rome on May 9, 1914, on the motion of a Mrs. Creighton. At the time, men were unsurprisingly quick to condemn female vanity as a main extinction threat. For example, when the plumage bill failed to pass in the House of Commons in 1920, H.W. Massingham, writing under the nom de plume of Wayfarer, made the following comments. "What does one expect? They have to be shot in parenthood for childbearing women to flaunt the symbols of it. And as Mr. Hudson says, one bird shot for its plumage means 10 other deadly wounds and the starvation of the young. But what do women care? Look at Regent Street this morning." In a reply essay entitled The Plumage Bill, Virginia Woolf responds to Massingham misogyny by pointing out that it was the male hunters slaughtering the birds, the male profiteers controlling the trade, and the male parliament that failed to pass protection measures. Now considered one of the earliest examples of ecofeminist writing, Woolf prompts her audience to question the social code that unconsciously condemns women's pleasures, the love of beauty and fashion as sin, whereas men's pleasures, their lust for hunting, women and money, are accepted, even valorised. I would go as far to argue that this love of beauty was instrumental to Paradise's eventual protection. Just as the birds of paradise had taught the likes of Mrs. Astor and Mrs. McKay what exuberant excess was all about, they also taught women like Mrs. Creighton and Virginia Woolf that this excess was worth protecting for the bird's own pleasure. This revert ethology underlines that even in their disembodied and dislocated commodity forms, the birds of paradise retain an ability to reach out and touch people through their aesthetic and ethological encounter value, and that from the outset, their livelihoods constituted and made a difference to the world-making entanglements that both brought them to the brink of extinction and about a full ban on hunting in New Guinea in 1931. Returning to the blue bird of paradise, it is clear it is both a telling example of the millions of paradisa that were mobilised as commodities, and that on its own it still continues to seduce. For example, when Sarah Jessica Parker, who plays Carrie Bradshaw in Sex and the City, was asked in an interview which piece of clothing from the 6 seasons and 2 movies of the franchise she would have liked to have kept, she replied, "It's the bird. I wasn't allowed to keep the bird Carrie wore at the wedding that never happened. The blue, beautiful bird. I can't get the bird. They won't give me the bird. The bird has eluded me." The now iconic bird will continue to frustrate Parker as it remains in New York Vintage's permanent archives under the careful custodianship of Benavides, available for rent only. Her desire to have the bird is, however, reminiscent of the voracious feather lust so ridiculed by the cartoonists of Punch and Puck at the time of the plume boom. You can see that down the bottom. And this may not have been lost in the costume designer for Sex and the City the movie. The ill-fated Carrie in Big Wedding marks the height of the character's materialistic hedonism. The jilted Carrie in an excessive cream puff Vivienne Westwood gown and the blue bird of paradise headpiece decries the length she has gone to attract her mate in this exchange with the character Miranda. Carrie says, "I put a bird in my head." And Miranda says, "Is that what it was? I thought it was feathers." And Carrie says, "It was a bird." The blue bird thus becomes a mocking embodiment not only of the death of Carrie and Big's love, disregarding the inevitable fairy tale reunion at the end of the movie, but also, more importantly, her ridiculous materialistic excess. It also raises perplexing questions concerning my own position as modern-day plume hunter. Why I'm not killing these birds like the Malay, Dutch, Chinese and Australian hunters who thought their fortunes travelling to New Guinea at the zenith of the trade, I do find myself coveting their remains. And although it is now illegal to hunt or export birds of paradise, many bird of paradise species continue to be threatened through a black market trade in their plumes, and because their habitat is slowly being destroyed through New Guinea's contemporary exports in gold, copper, timber and coffee. If the latest report prove accurate, many bird of paradise species are said to be on a flight to oblivion. This is why, to conclude, it is worth reflecting on the telling hue of the blue bird of paradise. Where the dyed blue skin was mobilised in Sex and the City the movie to act as Carrie's something blue, I have mobilised the blue bird of paradise as a telling example of near extinction. However, where blue is often connoted with despondency and depression, Vivienne Dupre urges us to mourn well in this time of mass extinction. We must not be taken over by melancholia, but rather bring the dead into active presence. To do so, Van Duren argues scholars need to take a particularly lively approach to telling stories about life and death and the shadow of extinction, by, he says, weaving tales that add flesh to the bones of the dead and dying, that give them some vitality, presence, and perhaps thickness on the page and in the minds of the readers. This is what I've been tempted to do with the Paradisiae. By tracing the bio-geographies of these commodities, the aim was to demonstrate how lively excess mobilised the birds as commodities and almost brought about their extinction, but also enabled them to resist what Haraway calls the externalism of the Capitalocene, offering a way for them to cling to life. Attachments are thus very important in the story. The Paradisiae's exuberant excess remained attached to the preserved commodity forms, inspiring humans to form both corporeal and ethological attachments with them from New Guinea's rainforest to New York streets, and to move from attaching them as accessories to attaching their accessory feathers with a significance beyond humanist modes of valuation. And just as the Paradisiae helped to further contest the idea of human-only understandings of encounter value, they also undermine the idea of human-only history by highlighting both a deep evolutionary continuity between humans and other social animals and our ethological entanglement in a more than human world. And just as many social historians have warned against the habit of losing oneself in the study of origins, the symbiogenesis of humans and the birds of paradise warns against tracking the origin stories or indeed the social histories of individual species. For example, the social lives of birds of paradise in both life and death co-shaped human understandings of sexual selections and therefore the excessiveness and inventiveness of life itself. Moreover, not only have they taught humans what profligacy was all about, but they've also warned us against being profligate consumers. And with the actual blue bird of paradise, that's the Paradisea rudolphi, listed as vulnerable due to habitat loss and the continued hunting of the males for their plumes, the dyed blue bird of paradise needs to be brought into active presence to reteach us, as Haraway writes, how to become less deadly, more responsible, more attuned, more capable of surprise, more able to practice the arts of living and dying well in a multi-species symbiosis. Storing the blue bird of paradise trans-species social histories, what I've termed Bio-Geographies, is therefore a form of active remembrance, a way of working towards multi-species recuperations and resurgence. At its simplest form then, a form of lively earth writing. And just to end, I just thought I'd show you that it's not, my practice isn't just about writing. I often use these birds in my teaching, but also creating exhibitions. So when I was a postdoc in Canada, I actually didn't have a job yet. I was a postdoc, but I didn't have a paid employment. I went along to their, they had a fashion and textiles collection. I was like, brilliant, I might just go along there and see if they've got any feathered remains, any birds in their collections. And I typed in hat with bird into their database and up popped this. And I knew immediately it was a bird of paradise. And this, I had a chat with the curator and she said, oh, we've got loads of these millinery trimmings in the back. And so she brought out these trays and trays of birds, lots of different species. You've got a metallic starling here, and this we think might be the extinct Carolina parakeet. But it's often very difficult to tell what species or which bird they actually come from because they've been dyed. They're often quite Frankensteinian. For example, this one it's not its own wings on the bird, it's other wings that have been pinned to it, so we just don't know what you're dealing with at all. They're quite Frankensteinian creatures. And all this kind of led to an exhibition called Fashioning Feathers, and that took place at the Royal Alberta Museum at the university. And basically it was written of it, Fashioning is a beautiful collaborative effort between natural and human history, between Royal Alberta Museum and the Material Culture Institute of the University of Alberta, and between fashion, millinery work and the endangerment of a whole class of animals. And so what we were trying to do here was really kind of challenge those traditional ways in which we've separated natural and human history, and in fact the museum was totally set out that way. So on one side you had kind of human cultural history, on the other side you had natural history, and then we had this exhibition space in the middle where we brought the two together. It was the first exhibition to draw on both collections at the same time, and it was quite fun to work on the project because it was the first time the natural history collectors, who were all men of course, chatted to the fashion curators, who were all women of course. And so they were chatting, we brought them together, and you can see here they were trying to identify which birds' wings were coming from. These were just actually, I think they were pheasant feathers that had been dyed green. So it just tells you there's quite a lot of fakery going on in the craft of the plumacier as well. And these are some photos from the exhibition. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Merle. There was so many threads to that presentation, conceptually and in terms of kind of disciplines and ideas. It was just really, really wonderful. While you're gathering your thoughts, I will do a promo for our next lecture, which will be in a month, actually the 15th of November. And it's being presented in collaboration with the Intercultural Performance Studies Research Group, yeah, I think that's what it's called. And so it's actually at their seminar time, which is earlier, it's 2 to 4, Wednesday 2 to 4, so apologies to those who are teaching at that time. But Wednesday the 15th of November, 2 to 4, we'll have Leela Matsumoto, who will be talking about collaboration between literature, sculpture and renewable energy in Scotland. So another quite sort of interdisciplinary presentation. So, questions, comments for Merle? I'd like to kick off.
Well, not really, I don't have to be formally, so it's very, very interesting, completely outside of my typical area. I was interested in the gendered nature of the co-option of the biological form into the human environment, and I guess I'm particularly interested that the local indigenous groups, having the men were mimicking the male bird, but then transporting it into the outside of its context. You have the women, the women co-opting it in a kind of more classical interpretation from a westernized perspective from that perspective. And I just always kind of interested in that as the transformation of the cultural interpretation of the bird as well, reflecting kind of colonial aspects.
Absolutely. I find it really fascinating. Stuart Pearce, the anthropologist I cited, he writes really beautifully about that, and he calls it this kind of reverse anthropology, where Western women were kind of doing a similar practice but differently to the Yogam dancers, who were the male of the tribe, who were mimicking what the birds actually did. Because obviously it was the females that drove sexual selection, because they were choosing the mates. But it's interesting, in the Western context, it was women trying to attract mates through wearing birds of paradise. So often you'd wear feathers on one side, I can't remember if it's the left or right now, I can't remember, to say whether you're available or not. And so if you're a woman and you're looking for a mate, probably with lots of money, that's what you would do. I think it was on the left-hand side, to say that you weren't married. It basically told your suitors that you were available. So it was very much tied up in that whole practice and that performance.
And also, I guess at that point, the economic value, but being able to demonstrate the feathers also demonstrated the value that you already had the value to buy them in the first place. Well, again, which I'm thinking in the indigenous context, I guess the young men go out and catch their own bird feathers or whatever.
Yeah, so absolutely.
It's not tied in with that.
No, it's not tied in the same sort of. Obviously, it's a different type of valuation, whereas obviously it's much more of an economic valuation. So you know about a young woman's wearing bird of paradise feathers, she's a woman of means, which again on the marketplace, in the sexualised marketplace of the 19th and early 20th century, knowing that she had money would obviously tie an extra capital value to the women as well, because that's what women were kind of seen as, unfortunately.
Thank you for an absolutely fascinating paper. You made a really powerful case for reconnecting human and non-human histories. I wonder what you think about non-human agency, or whether for you that's an important category, or whether it's more about interdependence.
I think it's definitely, on its own, is obviously really important, but I guess it is that interdependence for me that really, I guess because their lives are so inextricably entwined with ours, and particularly their lives as a species, or as a genus, their continued life, then I guess you can't really intertwine them. So it's obviously important to think about the agency of non-humans. Of course that's important to consider the agency of non-humans. But I think considering them apart from is quite difficult, because we have to think of them as inextricably intertwined with us in this kind of symbiogenesis. Otherwise, because we have to work together to get to that more multi-species recuperation, I guess. So I definitely think non-human agency is extremely important, and giving priority to that is important, but I think these shared and entangled stories are worth telling, because obviously they still remain, and they're what's going to guide how these lives worlds might be recuperated or not. So I guess that would be I don't know if that's a very good answer to your question.
Richard?
Could I pursue that a bit further?
Yeah, of course you can.
Because I've been quite troubled by as much as anything, by the extraordinary abundance of the appearance of this word agency in I suppose, new materialism and so on. And I think you've given me a bit more information about its valence in that world, because I think you're using it in a very specific sense, as in agency means the initiation of other events.
Yeah.
Would that be right? Because I'm always...
It's a relational aspect rather than it being of a particular thing, I guess.
Yeah, because I feel it's being asked to do a huge amount of work at the moment, that word. And it sits somewhere between causality and deliberate action, I suppose. And clearly, for some non-human creatures, deliberate action is the appropriate idea. But for much of what you're talking about, particularly when you're talking about the continuing agency of the feathers of these dead birds, that couldn't be what it is. So is it simply the capacity to initiate more event?
Yeah, I would kind of, that's a nice way to put it, and I might steal that, so that's a great way of doing it. But yeah, I guess it's more the event of these objects, or the event of these animals, and the things that they initiate. And in that sense, I think that I guess that's how I kind of see them as being, having these relational agencies that do initiate different encounters and encounters with them and responses to them.
By the continuing attractive power, then. Because of course
which goes beyond just the species.
They didn't ask to
the
be
subject.
shot for feathers, no,
of course not. Yeah.
So in that sense, it wasn't their action, was it? But
no, it wasn't their action. No, but they still continue to have actions, I would say, because like if you look at them, you can understand why. It's about the kind of, you can understand why you'd want that on your hat. Maybe you can't.
No, I can. I mean, taxidermy is powerful, generally.
And millinery.
And millinery, yeah.
Maybe, yes, can I just also follow up from what Richard's troubled by? So obviously the move to acknowledge other than human agency was an endeavour to get away from the idea that only humans were subjects and had agency. But maybe there's a risk in this, as Richard puts, a kind of proliferation of the use of the term agency, that you lose respect for sort of activities which are deliberative, if you like. I mean, there's a difference, isn't there, between the agency of the male bird of paradise who is displaying to attract a mate, and the allure of the feathers of the slaughtered bird. And so I hear Richard sort of voicing a kind of word of caution, because in fact what you precisely want to re-acknowledge, as in other than human agency, can get lost if agency is used too promiscuously.
And I suppose I often see it associated with what I think are straw man arguments, in the sense that, in that lesser sense, if you like, or at least non-deliberative sense of agency, I'm not sure anyone ever has denied that the non-human world had agency. After all, that would be to deny material causality altogether. So the rhetorical force of it is a bit unclear to me, especially when it's announced as a magnificent new discovery. But I don't think you weren't doing that. You weren't doing that. I wasn't out, because I think that sense of it as initiating action is an interesting, different one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important, and I appreciate that, actually, the idea of the obviously it's a different type of act. The act of the male bird of paradise, when it's hanging over and it's making those noises, it's just like so. It's vibrating. It's got that kind of power to it, which you don't get with them at all. So it's a different kind of. But I don't know if you'd still call it deliberate though. That's the thing.
Yes, that's a different question.
Yeah, that's a different question. Yeah, absolutely. And that's about evolutionary creativity, and I guess that is sexual selection, and that is that excessiveness. So that excessiveness is, you can't kind of boil it down to belonging to one particular agent. It's beyond particular agents, I guess, whether human or non-human.
And there's that term distributed agency.
Yeah, absolutely.
Helpful there.
Yeah.
So we've got Owen and Sam both quite keen to come in here.
Well, I was just wondering about the David Rothenberg Survival Beauty stuff, where it starts off talking about the peacock feather and so going beyond sexual selection to thinking about the aesthetic senses that might be in nature, and then and an argument for why this stuff is continuing, in evolutionary terms. But then this puts a pretty sort of difficult twist on it all, doesn't it? Because the thing, obviously they become, the effective drive for humans to have these things because of their qualities. Then the survival of beauty becomes the destruction of beauty.
Yeah.
So I think it'd be worth checking
I will check
Rothenberg out anyway. Yeah, if you know.
That's brilliant, thanks.
Sam.
I still love that talk, thank you. This was a sort of new materialism versus things being alive or not being alive point, just following from the conversation, was that I really liked your use of the term lively commodities, which I think is actually really different from vibrant matter. The idea of a lively commodity is as you put it, sort of like a commodity that's inert, but that still creates effect and kind of holds lots of different meanings and has lots of different resonances and produces effect. And I think that bringing the idea of vibrant matter or these birds as a vibrant, as having an agency in their death is not something we're doing, of course, but is potentially offensive when these birds have been denied agency through their slaughter. If I was killed and my body went off and did a whole load of things, I wouldn't want to think that it had the agency that I lost, And these things do become important when, as Richard was saying, agency kind of pops up everywhere in terms of when we talk about matter, and a lot of people are routinely denied agency.
And I guess that's why it relates to ethics as well, which I hadn't really thought about. That's a good point. And I guess the problem is, with a lot of the new materials and stuff, is that everything is vital. And there's a bit of a smear of equivalence going on there, because it's just like, well, what isn't vibrant matter then? So that's why I was kind of careful to say, although I'm talking about these bio-geographies, so lively geographies, there's also, it kind of masks these necro-geographies, these killing practices and the slaughter of the birds as well. Because also, I guess, the problem with the lively commodity is that, it's not always lively. Or it's lively at certain points, but in different ways. So that's really helpful, thank you.
Alexandra.
I'm just wondering how, in the light of all of this really, really, really interesting conversation and a fabulous talk, I was really, really engrossed, not just because I love Sex and the City and a really horrible relationship. I'm like, what are you doing? This is the worst thing. Stop watching it. But I just wonder how, in the light of all that, I'm really intrigued by the continued actual physical transformation of the feathers that you mentioned in terms of the dyeing of the plumage and the Frankensteinian construction of them afterwards in terms of that these things are being brought into this sort of sense of lively commodity, but they're then transformed beyond their original plumage, which to me seems even more ridiculous than the whole, these things are coveted because of their natural, quote, quote, beauty, and are then transformed again. And I just wonder how you, how do you respond to that? How do you read that in relationship to these kind of questions of ongoing agency and non-human relationships? I just find that a really kind of sticking point that why would you do that? Is my question.
Well, it was definitely one of mine when I first encountered them, so it's like, why would you dye black? Oh my god! Because most of them were dyed black, because obviously women were in mourning for long periods of time.
Right, okay.
It was a very expensive fashion item, so you're going to get as much wear of it out of it as you possibly can, so you'd have it dyed black. So it would go with any outfit.
I'm in mourning, but I'm still wearing my fancy coat. That's like having your cake and eating it too.
Yeah, totally. And I've been to visit a plumasserie, one of the last remaining plumasserie workshops in Paris, and it's got loads of birds in paradise, particularly I think the minor and apoda specimens that have been dyed all different colours, like blue, purple, to go with the changing dress code and what have you. So in that sense, it's kind of, it is dampening, or it is degrading their liveliness again in that way, but there's still something of that. It's still, so even when they're dyed black, you can't get rid of the iridescence, and you can't get rid of the quality of the plumes either. So there's still something, it's still that kind of quivering, it's a movement, and it really does cling to it. So even though it's gone through all these pretty horrendous transformations and it's been so sort of massacred, you still can't get away from the fact that, you know, like it still has a power to seduce, and it's that power of seduction which still remains attached to the bird. So it's that kind of idea of attachment again. So that even though, like, you know, it has been so sort of damaged, it still has that kind of that liveliness is still attached to it. And in a way, maybe that's pushing it too far, but
No, it's really
that's a really good point to sort of reflect on as well, is thinking about, you know, the ways in which they've kind of been not only killed, but they've had further indignities.
Yeah, it's just like a really quick point following on from that. But like, if you, I don't know much about feathers, so maybe only birds of paradise are that beautiful. But if you could do things with pheasants, or if you can do things with birds that are more common, you know, you could get a dove and paint it blue. Why didn't they?
Well, they did, because that was part of the trade as well. So you had a whole sort of that was part of the craft of diplomacy. It was obviously you didn't have the whole marketplace wasn't just well chapeaued and well heeled women. It was women who every woman was wearing a hat with feathers on it at that time. So for the women who had less money in their purse, they would, you know, dye duck feathers. You know, farmyard, all the farmyard feathers, they would shape them. I mean, I wonder if I could just get some images up actually really quickly, if you don't mind. Do you mind about time?
What we could do, if you liked, you could get a glass of wine and we could continue in a sort of, in a bibulous manner, our conversation.
I read an article on W.H. Hudson when he wrote about the bird of the lemur, and it mentioned that their way of getting gulls' wings, I think it was in particular, was to tear the wing off the living bird.
That's what they did with egrets. So snowy egrets, they were very popular at the time as well, because again, they were white feathers, and you could dye them all the different colours. They also had a particularly ethereal quality as well to them. And so they were just, and because they were had big rookeries, they were also quite tame birds. So you could just walk up to the rookery and they would just rip the wings off the birds and then leave their young starving. And so there's lots of images actually from the time, from the RSPB, of this going on. It's called, they have like placards of the egret story, and it was storying this account of the egrets, which was happening across. And actually Virginia Woolf's The Plumage Bill, she recounts this story as well. So she kind of, in the start of the Plumage Bill, she creates this kind of really narcissistic woman of fashion, she called Lady So-and-so, who's going along Regent Street to get her yellow coloured egret feather for her opera ensemble. And she said, doesn't Lady So-and-so look lovely in her outfit? And then she kind of turns the tables, and then she immerses you in the kind of Argentinian pampas where these birds are being kind of destroyed and ripped, and their young are being left to starve and stuff like that. She kind of moves these kind of landscapes of the kind of cosmopolitan London Regent Street to kind of the death zones of the hunting grounds, which is kind of like a really clever way to do it.
Well, it's very similar to the anti-fur campaigns of the last 20 years or so, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, particularly in their first quite misogynistic phase.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
They've sort of faded away quite a lot, haven't they? There was really...
They've stopped adopting that misogynistic version of it, I think. Yeah.
Well, all those big billboards and things.
Quite a lot of the picture campaigns use like
This is Carlos. He's kind of showing me, these are snowy egret feathers, so this is why they were so, because they were just like, you can see how beautiful they were. And then this is Bird of Paradise, and then that's a snowy egret. But like these are kind of like what the Parisian plumassier is. So this is Le Marie, which is the last surviving plumassier in Paris. It was bought over by Chanel in 1997 as part of their paraffection for the love of it. So they've been buying up independent fashion ateliers, including Le Marie. And so it's because it's one of the last feather workers in Europe. And so they were making like these pads of feathers, and so that these would be made out of duck and other types of feathers. So after the actual bands came in, the plumassiers obviously had to become much more clever with how they were using the feathers, and so actually you can see how just like lots of peacock feathers, pheasants, duck, down feathers, that kind of thing were used and shaped into the wings of birds. I don't think I've got them on here actually, sorry, but there's amazing. So I've got amazing photographs of just all these different shapes and colours, and particularly as the 1920s wore on, it became about like really kind of geometric shapes as well, and bright colours, and with the jazz age and stuff like that. But they were mainly farmyard feathers by that point because it was the trait that they were banned.
Did you say which journal this is heading for? Have you...
Journal of Social History. It's a special issue on the preserved animal body.
Well, it's kind of a general. I'd like to kind of carry on after, rather than you want to let people.
Well, I was just wondering about actually moving into kind of more conversational mode. Unless, did anybody else have a question?
Well, I was just wondering, again, fascinating, so many things in there. I was quite fascinated by this thing with the feather trade, which I've been reading about it recently in the context of the ostriches.
Oh, of course, yeah. I'm writing a paper about that right now.
Because they, of course, ended up being farmed, didn't they? So you look at
well, you had a lot of. It's really interesting because in the debates about there's also I gave another paper at the RGS this summer about debates in Nature, the journal Nature, that were covering the plumage trade, and so actually in their letters to the editor section, it's like the most highly sort of written about thing regarding human-caused extinctions was around the plumage trade, and there's a lot of debates about it, and they were kind of arguing how to go about whether they should bring in conservation or not. And they were also saying because the scientists, their role was to kind of temper that of the humanitarian or the kind of the cruelty league, the kind of the sentiments of them. And so they were kind of trying to combine kind of scientific and economic interests. And so they suggested, like the ostrich, that kind of snowy egrets could be farmed, birds of paradise could potentially be farmed. And so there was, because obviously the ostrich was the kind of the example of the farmed animals, so it was obviously wild and it was domesticated, and so this is an example of the ostrich plumes here. So we had these ostrich mansions where the owners of the ostrich farms lived, and it was a massive, huge trade. Usually Jewish actually immigrants to South Africa that were kind of involved in the trade actually. But again, it kind of tells this really kind of violent colonial history of the kind of the movement of peoples off lands. There's a great illustrated London News which takes you on a tour of an ostrich farm, and it shows you, like these ostrich kind of compounds. Actually, they were kind of like big, sort of like almost like forts in a way, of fortresses, and it says like underneath it, in case of, this is a really racialized term, so I don't like using it, but Kaffir insurrection. So you get a real sense of the violent kind of colonial geographies, which really underlay the kind of the domestication of the ostrich.
Because I sort of struck also by there are parallels between how live animals are treated.
Absolutely.
Now we've sort of been doing. Part of our sort of project has been around this sort of high-end eco-tourism and how the landscape and the wildlife are kind of served up for the consumption of very rich people, really, basically. And you get animals presented as wild when they're actually, they're kind of semi-domesticated, really. They're very rare and endangered animals, but they're reliably there in a particular place at a particular time for the future.
The lively commodity, I guess, comes into that.
I'm trying to work out how all this kind of new tourism stuff sort of applies to that, and it's curious. But my question actually was about how it'd be a mistake, wouldn't it, to think that the kind of exorbitant agency of these birds was somehow responsible for them becoming such a luxury item, you know, because the trade is obviously created and sort of well, it was just like a hyper profitable item, isn't it?
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can transport it, it doesn't weigh very much, you can cut
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
So there must have been presumably, you know, a lot of promotion of the idea that, you know, the fashionable woman around town will be wearing this. You know.
Absolutely, because of but that it did all kind of stem from, again, when the first tradeskins came over, and it was that kind of item of curiosity,
Right.
and it was about that, you know, kind of ignition of that kind of that really enduring American fascination with the birds of paradise, not just as scientific curiosities, but as kind of objects of aesthetic desire. And so I do think it does have a kind of lasting effect. And of course, the trade was about kind of promoting them as this is a next fashion accessory, and this is what you should have in your wardrobe this season. But I think that still came from the fact that the reason they were thought that way, because they were, you know, seen as so rare and so valuable and so exotic. Yeah. And I think that does come from the birds themselves, yeah. and that encounter value that I talked about.
Were artificial ones ever made?
Of birds of paradise?
Fake ones, yeah.
Yeah, I mean they fake the kind of, they try to fake the shape of them. So with an ostrich feather, for example, you can, it's called burnt ostrich technique, where you can try and burn away the feather so you get a kind of more, it's supposed to look a bit more ethereal, so it's not as like fluffy. But I mean it doesn't look like a bird of paradise. I mean people would try and fake them, because obviously you wanted to have the bird of paradise.
Or even completely, I suppose you couldn't at that stage produce synthetic feathers, could you really? But
no, I don't think so.
But now you could. Yeah.
Now you could, yeah. You could definitely try. But if you can see on here, this has got like lots of feather extensions on it, which tells you the other story of this. Which is obviously lots of women actually in New York again worked in Plymouth sweatshops making the tiny knots on there. Do you see that little knot?
So that aspect of it.
So again, like this was a hugely, it was an all-female labour force as well. It was women working in sweatshops or at home in the tenements, and so they would take home big bags of this, and the whole family would work on, like because obviously they're so tiny. It's mainly children so it's like a lot of child labour that was involved in the production.
Tiny little knots in them.
Tiny little knots, yeah. So they're called feather extensions. So you'd want to make it a more luxurious, and so you'd have like a kind of inferior feather, but they would add these feather extensions too to make it much more of a luxury commodity.
Like a hairpiece.
Like a hairpiece, so feather extensions, not feather extensions too, although that would be
hair extensions.
Yeah,
that's right.
There was an odd craze when I was in Canada for people having this feather.
Yes, I've seen that.
It's really weird. Yeah.
I think we should break here. Thank you everybody for your discussion, and thank you so much, Mark.